Good afternoon. Delighted to have you here today. Whenever I think of Middle East peace, at least in the last 10 years, it's reminded me of David Fromm's book and the title, The Peace to End All Peace. That comes from a quote by a fellow named Archibald Wavell, who at one point was Viceroy of India, but at the time that he offered that observation concerning the Middle East, he was a major on General Allenby's staff in Palestine when the Versailles Treaty was entered into. And he said something like this: I see our treaty makers in Paris to end the war to end all wars has entered in the peace to end all peace. And all of us certainly hope that that is not the case, but looking at the current status of the Middle East, it's awful. I asked Dan Kurtzer, who's a friend, how are things going? And he looked at me like I was somewhat insane, and he said, well, reminds him, at least, of Mrs. Lincoln being asked, well, other than that, how'd you like the play? With reference to what's going on in the Middle East right now. Obviously, lots of challenges in front of us as the years progress. 22 years ago, as the Soviet Union fell and the Gulf War came to close, the United States brought Israel and all of its Arab neighbors together for the groundbreaking Madrid Peace Conference. At the same time, during his tenure here at USIP, our first president, Sam Lewis, who's in the front row today and has joined us today, and Ken Stein penned a report on, quote, making peace between Arabs and Israelis, end quote, that laid the groundwork for USIP's work on the Arab-Israeli conflict. In the years since, we have seen some shifts toward peace in the region, but at least as many setbacks. With Sam's encouragement in 2006, Ambassador Dan Kurtzer joined Scott Lesinski, then at USIP, in forming USIP's study group on Arab-Israeli peace. The study group brought together some of the most respected authorities on U.S. policy and the Arab-Israeli conflict: Bill Quandt, Shibley Telhami, and Steve Spiegel, to draw lessons from years of negotiations and offer recommendations on the way forward. In 2008, Dan and Scott published Negotiating Arab-Israeli Peace, a must-read for diplomats, policymakers, and analysts alike. Today, we congratulate the members of the study group on the publication of its second book, The Peace Puzzle, a work that seeks to elucidate and often correct the historical record of U.S. engagement in the peace process. The authors draw on over 100 interviews with current and former policymakers, diplomats, archivists, activists, and analysts, aiming to offer a well-rounded and objective history of U.S. diplomatic efforts, often turning a critical eye to their own involvement, and always mindful of the implications of those engaged today, in seeking to resolve this conflict. On behalf of both USIP and the authors, I also want to acknowledge USIP's Britt Manzo, Senior Program Assistant on the Arab-Israeli team, for her management of the project. I understand from the authors that her boundless substantive and logistical support was invaluable in bringing this book to fruition. Today, three of those authors, Professor Bill Quandt, Ambassador Dan Kurtzer, and Professor Shibley Telhami, will discuss their conclusions and what they mean for diplomatic and political engagement in the current U.S., Israeli, Palestinian, and broader regional climate. They're joined by Lucy Kurtzer-Ellenbogen, and also someone who needs no introduction whatsoever to this crowd, journalist and author David Ignatius. And with that, I'll turn it over to whoever is supposed to start this off.
I think that would be me. I'm David Ignatius, columnist for the Washington Post. Thank you to Jim Marshall and to USIP. When I was sent a copy of this book when it was in a manuscript and asked to make a comment on it, what we writers call a blurb, the blurb I offered began, "Read it and weep." And that's really my starting point in introducing our discussion. The value of this book, and I hope of the discussion that we're going to have, is that it's painful. It is a story of difficulty, of need, of hope, aspiration, and repeated failure. And most of all, as everyone here knows, it's a story of frustration. It's a story of frustration, first because so many people in Israel and in the Palestinian territories, in Washington and around the world, basically know what the shape of a settlement of these issues would be. I think we could all list the elements of the deal that someday will create a Palestinian state. And we've known the basic outlines for many years now. We've come so close in the offer that Ehud Olmert made, that Condoleezza Rice describes in her memoirs, in which there was a map of what that state would look like. We know about the Clinton parameters and the extent to which President Clinton, in his final days and hours in office, was able to take this process. We know about the Baker Plan, the Reagan Plan. We know about all the work that Bill Quandt did in preparation for Camp David and the Camp David agreements themselves. So that's the first frustration, is how close this is and how much we know about what it would look like. The second is from the Arab side, the frustration of so many years of occupation. I'll just cite one moment that sticks in my mind at a dinner party some years ago in Paris when I lived there. And an Arab friend said to me, "I can't bear this. I've lived my whole life arguing about this question. Am I going to die with this question unanswered?" It was a very, sort of broke up the dinner party. Next, I'd say it's a story of frustration in Israel. Deep longing for resolution of these issues, for the kind of security that only a peace agreement could bring. If you want a new reminder of that sense of frustration and longing, I went to the movies last weekend and saw a trailer for a new film called The Gatekeepers, which is interviews with 6 heads of Shin Bet, the fearsome, tough Israeli security organization that was responsible for internal security. And these 6 figures, to judge by the trailer and the reviews that I've read, speak with this sense of frustration and longing. One of them said words to the effect, there's something about retiring from this job and looking back at your experience that turns you into a leftist. It was a wonderful comment, and so that's on my movie-going list. Finally, just to speak personally about, I've been writing about this for more than 30 years, almost 35 years. And I'm just going to pick one moment in that period. Along the way, I decided it would be useful to live in a Palestinian village. So I went to Halhul, which I'm sure many of you have driven past, just north of Hebron, just south of Bethlehem, found a stonecutter named Hamadi Kashkish, who would let me live in his house, and stayed there for a week or 10 days, just getting a sense of what it's like to live under occupation. That was a long time ago. That was 1982. Went back to see him a few years ago. And to my amazement, this was still a place with the same basic hope. Amazingly, it hadn't produced any suicide bombers. I asked Hamadi why that was so. He said, every time we see a young person really reaching that level of frustration and rage, we talk to them. We sit them down and talk to them out of it. With him, talking with people at Village, I had the sense that this is a story that's somehow going to end up in a place that we'd all like. I couldn't say how, but I hope I'll find out some new guideposts in our discussion. I want to close my opening remarks by quoting something that is inspiring, and you'd have to say hubristic, and that I hope will set the scene for the comments that follow. And I'm going to quote President Barack Obama in his speech in Cairo on June the 4th, 2009, when he said, "The situation of the Palestinians is intolerable. America will not turn our backs on the legitimate Palestinian aspirations for dignity, opportunity, and a state of their own. The only resolution is for the aspirations of both sides to be met through two states when Israelis and Palestinians each live in peace and security. That is in Israel's interest, Palestine's interest, America's interest, and the world's interest. That is why I intend to personally pursue this outcome with all the patience that the task requires. Well, it's painful reading those words almost 4 years later, and I now want to turn to Bill Quandt. Let me just tell you how we're going to organize this. First, Bill Quandt, who, like all of our speakers, has lived this story, is now at the University of Virginia, is going to talk about lessons learned, very powerful part of this book at the end. Then Shibley Telhami of the University of Maryland is going to talk about where we are now in this process and whether the door may be closing for changes on the ground. Then Lucy Kurtzer-Ellenbogen of the USIP will talk about the bottom-up sentiments that drive this process and also frustrate it, and how those fit with the diplomacy, which inevitably is top-down. And then finally, Dan Kurtzer, who's been our ambassador to Israel, to Egypt, is now a professor at Princeton, will close on why he thinks there's still hope in this process and where the opportunities for progress lie. I'll ask some questions, and then at 2 o'clock we'll turn to the audience and ask you for your questions in this group. But let me ask Bill to lead us off, please.
Okay, thank you very much, David, for that introduction. It was a sobering experience to work with my colleagues on this project, where we looked at the period from 1989, the Madrid lead up to the Madrid conference, and in the first Bush administration, and more or less concluded with the last year or so of President Obama's first term. And the excitement of doing this was that we got to talk to a lot of very interesting, informed, committed people who were willing now to talk about their judgments about what had worked and what hadn't worked. But of course, after all these 100 interviews or so that we did, we had to try to make our own sense out of the story. And it was a sobering experience, because this was a story that had a very unhappy ending. That time after time after time, initiatives had been launched which, for one reason or another, failed to succeed. We were focusing on the American part of this. There were Palestinian contributions to the failures. There were Israeli contributions. We were looking at what we might have done differently. So some people will look at this period and say, if these talented presidents and their secretaries of state couldn't get it right between 1989 and 2011 or 12, what makes you think it can be done? Maybe the lesson from this is that the Israeli-Palestinian part of this conflict is essentially impossible to resolve. Now, I don't draw that conclusion, although I do think we learned along the way that this is an unusually hard and complex issue. If it were simple, it would have been done long ago. So I want to take just a few minutes, maybe make 5 or 6 points that represent some of the conclusions about what we've tried in the past that doesn't work, and some of the things that, if we're going to ever engage again, and I hope we do, in trying to find a resolution to the Arab-Israeli conflict, guidelines that might serve us well. First point I would make is that if a president is audacious enough to tackle this problem again, he and his Secretary of State and his national security team better be very clear in their own minds why they're doing this. Unless they are convinced that they are doing it for reasons of fundamental American national interests, and that they can explain those national interests to the American public and to Congress, they probably shouldn't waste their time. If their idea is that we're doing this to help these poor benighted people who can't make peace on their own, and we'll give them a hand when they show they're ready, that's the rhetoric of we can't want this more than they do, but if they want it, we'll give them some help. And that, unfortunately, became the mantra of 2 recent administrations. In fact, Even President Obama used the language. If that's our attitude, that this is their conflict, if they want our help, they have to prove it by doing all the heavy lifting, and we will come in for the ceremonial signing on the White House lawn. Let's not bother, because it's not going to work. Second point I would say is that if a president thinks that the way to proceed is to find a special envoy and to turn this over to him or her, we didn't find any examples in our study of special envoys who had a record of success on their resume. Not that they didn't try, not that they didn't have interesting ideas. Many of them had credits from previous experience that were quite admirable, but on this particular issue, Arabs and Israelis have been spoiled to expect that when the United States gets serious, it's either the president or the Secretary of State who's on the job. So if we're going to do it, let's just accept that that's the level of commitment that it takes. The other thing that the president and the Secretary of State need, and this is perhaps self-serving because some of us have been in this role, is they need a really good team of advisors because they cannot stay on top of every single issue. And I sometimes have the feeling that we have treated this as an issue where the B team, that is the political activists who contributed to the president's election, make perfectly good candidates for key jobs that in fact take a lot of knowledge and a lot of sophistication and a lot of experience. And we can't afford the B team on this particular case if you want to succeed. Third point I would make is that timing matters. We saw two administrations recently wait until late in their last year to try to set things up for the deal. Literally, President Clinton was trying to put ideas forward a month before he was leaving office. You can't do it that way. There is a lame duck effect. So if you are going to do this, the president needs to look at his calendar and be realistic and say, I need to give myself enough time to begin to put the pieces in place and not wait until the very last moment. Now, the counter argument is we can't control the good timing. You have to wait for the lucky break. You know, some Sadat comes along and decides that he's going to make a radical new departure, and that provides the opportunity. This is the so-called ripening thesis. You sit and wait until the problem is ready, when it's ripe. We have waited far too long for things to ripen. They often get ripe and then they rot, and then we have to start all over again. I would say that one lesson I draw from this is that this so-called ripening approach to Middle East diplomacy is the wrong way to look at it. You help prepare the terrain by engaging. And that, the president's going to the Middle East in the spring. Already you can sense that people are beginning to think, how do we position ourselves to respond to that? Now, a trip alone does not create necessarily an opportunity, but the United States is still a big enough power so that when it decides it wants to move pieces on the chessboard, that can be important in and of itself. We don't have to be the ones who sit back and just react. Fourth and related point is about the confidence building measures that have often seemed to be the crucial piece of the puzzle before you get negotiations started. I think there's a long history of how we negotiated with the Soviet Union on arms control, and there the confidence building measures actually were quite important. But we have been through about 20 years of confidence building measures, and I think the record suggests that they don't build confidence. First of all, every small step turns into a struggle over who is going to win this round. And sometimes people fight as much over the little step in order to show that they're strong enough to hold out for the really big steps coming down the road. And I think we should simply accept that this model, however viable it may have been in a different context, is the wrong model for Arab-Israeli peacemaking. Instead, each side will need at some point to see what they get for whatever they have to give up. And that means the whole package has to be reasonably clear before anyone is going to make the small or large concessions that they will need to make in order to get the big payoffs. So I think instead of the step-by-step incrementalist confidence building approach, we need to look at a different model today. Fifth point I would make is that the United States, which perhaps in 1991 when we convened the Madrid conference, really did stand astride the world as the unquestioned superpower, having just emerged from the Cold War victorious. That's not the image of the United States, and it's not the reality of the United States anymore. I think we have to accept that we now need partners in the peacemaking business. Some to help pay the bills. This could be a very expensive process. If there are going to be, let's imagine, peacekeeping forces needed somewhere, we will need people to contribute that. We need Arab partners, European partners, and we need strong domestic public support. So there's a lot of politics that needs to go in to building the kind of coalition that can sustain a very complicated peace process. It's not just enough for the United States to operate as if this is a unilateral American initiative. We need to bring in others as well. My last point is that, of course, there is no guarantee of success. If we decide to go down this road of promoting Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, there is a reasonably good chance that we will not succeed. But I can pretty much guarantee you that if we sit on our hands and do nothing at all, we also will not succeed. So you have to make a judgment. Is it better to try with the small chance that you might succeed, with the quite substantial payoffs if you do, or you simply accept that this cannot be resolved, we're not going to invest any of our time and effort, and thereby ensure that this conflict that has consumed too many hours and days and years of the lives of too many people in this room will go on for another generation. I will start with as the perhaps pessimist amongst us, because I know you'll get more optimistic views at the end. It's a hard job, not impossible, but I have my doubts that we're up to playing the game based on the record of the past.
Well, thanks so much. That was a great start. And Bill, if you were the pessimist, I'm probably the realist between the optimist and the pessimist. First of all, I have to say that this has been an incredibly enjoyable project, producing this book. It took us 6 years of work. We obviously, the three of us on this stage, but we have also Scott Lasinski, who's here in the audience, and Steve Spiegel from UCLA. And it was really, truly a pleasure to work together. It was amazingly easy to work together. We come from different backgrounds. We've all looked at this and had our own minds made up on various issues. But it really, once we confronted the material that we're looking at, the interviews that we had, the materials that we're looking at, there were hardly any major divisions among us on the core issues.
Except the cover of the book.
Except the cover of the book. That was actually the most complicated process of agreeing on a cover of the book. So it really was truly a pleasure to work on the project. Let me start with where we are on the two-state solution, not just the viability of American diplomacy to address it, but the viability of a two-state solution, period. Most of us have been supportive of it and still think that it's probably the only way to end this conflict in this generation. But as an analyst who's been involved in this for decades and cares about it, I often wonder whether I am speaking with my heart or with my mind on this issue. Because it's very easy to make the case that it's no longer possible to have a two-state solution. And I think ultimately, if in fact there is historically no two-state solution and we move into a different project in the next generation, and we look back, and historians look back at what point did the two-state solution end, I suspect it wouldn't be today, it would be much earlier. So I think that we all are basically in a gray area of somewhat even uncertainty about whether it's still viable to have a two-state solution. And the question is why. I'll make 3 points right now about why to add anyway to the pessimism of Bill Quandt, even another layer, but then to take it somewhere else. The first is the facts on the ground. I mean, I think that we all talk about the settlement expansion, the infrastructure change. Obviously, the period we looked at earlier, beginning with 1989, if you look at the expansion of that project, is huge. And I know that theoretically, those of us who are still hopeful believe, well, you can address it. There are all these major blocks that are close to the border that you can encompass into Israel. You can have exchange of territory, but you still are going to have to end and essentially eliminate some major settlements in order for that to happen, with tens of thousands of people relocated. Is that really, really possible politically? Even if you think it's theoretically possible, it's a big question. But more to the point, the Jerusalem issue. And I think this is something we learned from this project. When we looked at the collapse of Camp David 2000, the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, there's no question that the Jerusalem issue was perhaps the most central issue in the failure of the negotiations. The Palestinians and the Israelis, and Palestinians certainly were more accommodating on territorial compromises beyond the Jerusalem issue, but neither had understood fully how important the Jerusalem issue to each side, and certainly the American side never understood it. I suspect, and I hear in the conversation now, no full understanding of the importance of this issue on either side. And if anything, I think Israeli compromise on the Jerusalem issue have become harder, even though in the discourse it's become easier to talk about it, especially given what happened at Camp David 2000 and given the Olmert-Abu Mazen negotiations. But in reality, if you look at the actual settlement plan, and particularly if you have the implementation of the recent announcement, particularly in the E1 bloc, it is impossible. To my mind, it is impossible. It is impossible, to my mind, as an analyst of this issue, to envision a viable, lasting two-state solution without a compromise on Jerusalem, without Palestinian control over Arab sections of Jerusalem. I just can't see it, not only for the Palestinians, but I can't see it in the Arab world. Jerusalem, today in the Arab world, particularly with the rise of Islamists even more in much of the Arab world in the era of the uprising, the Jerusalem issue is even bigger than the issue of Palestine itself. And so for that reason, I think there's not a full comprehension of this up front that needs to be addressed. But the second layer of problem, I think, for the two-state solution is the collapse of trust. I think if you look back, really from 1989 all the way to 2000, that period where we had that encompassed the Madrid conference and encompassed the Oslo agreements. If you look at that period, you can say all kinds. You could be very critical of American diplomacy, and you can be critical of the parties, and you can say Madrid conference wasn't really much of a success, and Oslo was a poorly negotiated agreement, all of which would be correct. But nonetheless, what they did was transform public expectations. And so we all know that it's all about betting. A public is betting. Are we going to have peace or are we going to have war? Is peace possible or is peace not possible? And you behave differently depending on what your bet is. And the bet in the 1990s was very clear. Peace is inevitable. That was even for people who didn't want it. You started finding people lining themselves up because that was the path where everybody's headed, and people were looking to figure out where they're going to be when the agreement comes to be on the right side of history. The betting has changed completely. And that betting we find in the public opinion polls, among Israelis, among Palestinians, but also among Arabs broadly. It's not that people don't want to see a two-state solution. Actually, on the Arab side particularly, we see majorities still believe that if there is a two-state solution with Israel pulling out of 67, they would support it. And certainly a large number of Israelis do. But what we found in the polling over the past several years is increasing majorities believe it will never happen. Both on the Israeli and the Arab side. The most recent polls, 55% say it will never happen on both sides. And those who believe it will happen in the next 5 years are less than 10%. So what we're seeing here is that people are betting it's not going to happen. When you're betting it's not going to happen, you behave in a different way. And it's very difficult to revive that confidence. People, and yet, and here is where I think while we get trapped in this caught up between wishful thinking our hearts and our minds, because when you ask people, okay, so if there is no two-state solution, what do you think will happen? Do you think there will be a one-state solution? On the Arab side, the overwhelming majority say no. They think there will be constant fighting for a long time to come, which is one reason why then nobody really wants to abandon it, because they don't have a better alternative. On the Israeli side, remarkably, there's a growing number of people who think, oh, maybe it'll be just the status quo. It wouldn't be more violence. And a little bit more acceptance, a little more living with the facts. So I think that is the reality on the ground that needs transformation. The question is, how do you transform public expectations? I am not one who believes that public expectations are unchanging. I think public opinion is changing. But in order to revive the kind of trust and shift that we're talking about, you need something big to happen. I mean, the transformation of expectations in the 1990s was the breakthrough of Oslo, the handshake between Arafat and Rabin that transformed expectations. So you need something big to do it. Where is that going to come from is the question. It is possible. Where is that going to come from? It isn't going to come from the parties. And that's the third point that I'm going to talk about in terms of where we are that makes it far more complicated. On the Israeli side, I know there has been some degree of optimism about the results of the Israeli elections. And I think the one thing that I think is positive about the Israeli elections is that the public isn't as ideologically committed, or at least not voting strictly on the behavior of an ideology of commitment to land that people think. Although, as we have come to know, the rise of labor and of Lapid were not really a function of anything related to the peace process, at least mostly not related to the peace process. It was more social issues and other issues. So the factor that shifted Israeli politics in the short term, I think, is not necessarily this particular issue. Still, if you look at what kind of coalition is likely to emerge in Israel, you're talking about one that is going to be mostly dominated by the right, and with essentially a settler constituency. And to the extent that you're going to have others in the center, there's going to be compromise. And the worst possible option to see is a government that gives the appearance of flexibility without actually being prepared to make the compromises. It's easier to deal when you know there's not going to be movement, or there's going to be movement in between. It's the most difficult one. And I worry about being dragged into a process without any results. On the other side, the Palestinian division remains extremely problematic, despite the public will among Palestinians in the Arab world to bring the two factions, Hamas and Fatah, together. The rising influence of Egypt in Palestinian policy, and Egypt's commitment to seeing reconciliation, I think the picture has changed. Hamas in Gaza thinks they're winning the historical battle, that Arab public opinion is on their side, that the changes of Egypt have helped them, that the Palestinian Authority has less to offer, and the Palestinian Authority sees no significant benefit in an agreement with Hamas, as it seems to essentially open up the West Bank for Hamas influence. So in the short term, both polities are dysfunctional when it comes to peace negotiations, and no one can expect any kind of a serious breakthrough from the constituencies as they are. So where is the breakthrough going to come? I think obviously that's where the eyes shift to the United States. Let me just say a couple of points on that, because I know that Dan is going to say more on that. First, obviously the administration now is at a point where it's going to consider what it is going to do. And my fear, just as we're talking, if we're being pessimistic, Bill Quandt is being pessimistic, I'm projecting, I'm so far talking about all the obstacles instead of what the opportunities are. If they're going to make that assessment, why would they make the bet that negotiation is possible? They start betting on something else. And I want to say, though, a couple of things related to that. Number one, there is no such thing as doing nothing. I mean, those people, who recommend, well, the administration could let that go. There is no such thing for a very simple reason, that America remains Israel's principal ally. And so doing nothing means what? When a UN resolution comes condemning Israel on settlements, you don't veto it? Well, if you veto it, obviously you're not doing nothing. So what happens when Israel is engaged in war with Hamas, which could obviously happen again, anytime in the next 2 years? So it is not really realistic. This is not a particularly meaningful idea when it's suggested. There is no such option for the United States of America. America is involved by virtue of its core relationship with Israel that is unavoidable, that is going to draw it in every time there is an core issue related to the Israel-Palestine question. Number two, peace process is no longer viable. Process, in quotation mark, is no longer viable because of the loss of trust, the profound belief that peace is not viable in the short term. Process is simply not going to work. So there is no one who is going to believe if we restart negotiations like we did 4 years ago or we did prior to that this is going to lead somewhere. No one is going to believe in it. I don't think it's going to help us. All it's going to do is waste time beyond that. Time is of the essence. So what is possible? In my own view, the first decision the administration has to make is, does it really want to try to address the Israel-Palestine question or not? That's a decision that they have to make early, because as Bill Quandt said, if you're going to do it, you're going to have to do it early. And related to that is the question, the first point that Bill made, which is this an American national interest or not? Because if you don't believe it's an American national interest, it's not worth doing, it's going to cost you too much, and you're going to fail. What we discovered, surprisingly, in our research is that even in the years of Bill Clinton, when Bill Clinton, to his credit, spent a lot of time on this issue and came close to addressing it, that even Bill Clinton never really believed this was an important national interest of the United States. He was doing it mostly because the Israelis were asking him. He thought he was doing good for the Palestinians, and ultimately maybe it became part of his historical legacy, but never really internalized it as a national security issue. And for that reason, by the way, therefore, never had like interagency consideration of the consequences of failure or blaming Arafat or any of those issues that came out of Camp David. This president has declared it as an important national security issue of the U.S. in the previous his first administration, but hasn't really behaved that way. And so therefore, I think it is something that's going to be critical for the U.S. to do. The second option is if the U.S. Isn't going to do a peace process, I think the option is not doing nothing, but take a principled position, which is help people on the ground, economic aid, humanitarian aid, take a principled position against the settlement issue like they started but didn't complete, and obviously take a position against violence against civilians and terrorism. Those are really the two options that are available to the administration, but there is no option of sitting back.
So in an attempt to somewhat bridge what Bill and Shibley have discussed, I wanted to just take a few moments to focus on where levels of diplomacy below the official Track 1 process fit in here. This would not be a sort of historic overview of all the Track 2 and below efforts that have accompanied this process over the years. Suffice it to say, there have been many, and they're still ongoing. But it is, to put forth somewhat of an argument for a continuation of these, the value of them, and actually particularly at this time, for many of the reasons that Shibley just mentioned. I want to also note that it is a little bit daunting and will probably be criminal to discuss Track 2 or Track 3 level diplomacy in this room without acknowledging that we have Hal Saunders here and Joe Montville, and that we don't have here Steve Spiegel, who was one of the co-authors of the book, who of course, all of whom have been pioneers on one level and the other, both on the theoretical and practical level of Track 2 and below engagement in this process. But the starting point for this is it struck me when I first read this book that when you go to the lessons learned section, after exhaustive coverage of US official engagement over the last couple of decades, that the authors chose to start this epilogue, the lessons learned, wrap-up part of the book, by referencing President Obama's September 2011 UN speech, in which Obama focused on the narratives that continue to divide the two sides, and the fact that what is really needed is for each side to essentially walk in each other's shoes. This was no big revelation. It's essential sort of to the thinking of conflict resolution, and I think most, if not all, policy makers would agree that this is valuable, but this hasn't tended to be the province of track one diplomacy negotiations. I think, again, that Israeli, Palestinian, US policymakers would say this is desirable, this is good, but this is sort of what comes after agreements have been negotiated and signed. Of course, the view of sort of track two process, that these go hand in hand in some sense, that you need both happening and supporting each other. This is certainly sort of a USIP view, if I can speak with that hat on, in the sense of you need the bottom up and you need the top down reinforcing each other. And again, I would argue, particularly at this time, for the reasons that Shibley actually just mentioned, that there's no full understanding on either side on some of even the key final status issues, despite years of discussion of these issues, that there's a need now to transform public expectations, that among Israeli Palestinians and other Arabs, the polls still bear out a desire for a two-state solution, but an utter despair that it's actually, or disbelief in the fact that it's actually going to come about. These are all things that are going to be necessary at a time when, more than ever in this region, particularly since the advent of the now ongoing Arab transitions, buy-in, public buy-in, seems an even more crucial point for achieving success on the official track. You now have Arab publics who are more free to make their positions heard, leaders who recognize the need, whether new leaders or existing leaders, and I think you see this particularly in the Palestinian case, who are aware that their legitimacy is fragile and therefore they need to be paying attention to the mood on the ground. And that mood is not, again, the polls would say that most people are hopeful for a two-state solution. But when you break that down and say, well, how will it happen? Again, we've seen this for years. It would be great ideally, but I don't believe it will happen. And I actually think there's something behind those polls more than just disbelief. I think sometimes that comes down to when you break down what it would actually take to achieve that two-state solution. The publics aren't as prepared as you would think or hope after these years to accept what it would really mean and take beyond the abstract. And I think that that's where a lot of preparatory work has not been done by the leaders on any side. There's a lot of talk when you talk about the bottom-up processes and the way leaders need to speak to people. There's been a lot of talk for years about how the leaders need to be speaking more effectively to the other side. You know, the whole debate about Israelis hear one thing from the Palestinian leadership when they're talking to them, but then go to their newspapers and say something else. The whole idea that, that mutually the leaders aren't reaching out effectively and communicating effectively to the other side. I think there's another layer to that, which is also the province of sort of track two and below work, which is the leaders aren't preparing their own peoples. There's not enough internal discussion going on. That is preparing each side for what the compromises really need to be, what peace will really mean, if there really is this desire, as the leaders state that there still is, to achieve a two-state solution. And as the polls bear out, that everybody ideally would like to see. So again, for the last couple of decades, there have been any number of track two and certainly grassroots track three, if you want to call it that, work. On the latter, you're seeing, unfortunately, a decline of that. You're seeing on the Palestinian side a growing, the anti-normalization sentiment has been around for a while, but it seems to me that that's actually only getting more stark. You also have the problem that if you look at polls, and Shibley, your work might have more to say, be able to flesh more out on this, but recent polls, there was a recent Israeli poll that looked at the Israeli public and showed that the demographic under the age of 30 had much more hardline views than the older generation on this issue. And on the Palestinian side, again, you're getting a similar dynamic. And part of this, the irony, we're talking about track 2, and people often hold up the model of the Oslo Process as, there was a track 2 process that actually led specifically into a track 1 process. But whatever one's thoughts of the outcomes of Oslo, one of the outcomes was you have greater separation. And so whereas an older generation of Palestinians have been used at some point to certainly professional interaction and sometimes social interaction with Israelis, you've had none of that with the younger generation for a number of years now, which again has only contributed to hardening positions. Palestinians interacting with Israelis under these circumstances are at checkpoints which don't tend to be the most positive of interactions and confrontations. So again, all of this argues for some really robust work to be done, and it's not just robust work in the traditional sense. There have been many initiatives over time, but they have tended to engage the same players over time. And those are players that need to still be engaged, but I think there needs to be an eye towards broadening the constituencies of people being engaged in these processes. How you do that can be challenging. Arguably, some of the people that you need to engage who increasingly are representative of the publics that need to be brought along are of harder line views, maybe some would opt out of even participating in these processes to start with. But it is vital that one finds one way, and maybe that starts, again, on each side with having those conversations internally and having people being able to feed these into broader track 2 processes. Because the more that voices that increasingly are carrying the day on both sides are isolated from these processes, then the ability of the output of track 2 engagement to filter back up into the policy level, or what you want to do is filter up but also filter out into the public, is minimal because there isn't the legitimacy among the participants to get their message across to those that need to hear it. We've taught, both Bill and Shibley mentioned the idea, I know Bill certainly in wrapping up the lessons learned, of preparation. And where that has been lacking at times. It's brought out very starkly in the book when you look at Camp David. And while this doesn't appear in the lessons on here of the book, part of that preparation, arguably certainly with Camp David too, could have been a robust track 2 process leading up to that, or certainly complementing that, that adds some of these issues that once in a much more public arena became much more sensitive, and the parties weren't able to go there, and surprises maybe that should not have been surprises could have been avoided. I would just argue as well for the fact that one of the problems when you look at U.S. engagement, which is in this process, I think that the U.S. should be actively supporting to the extent possible track 2 and below processes, but it is important, if these processes are going to be successful, to them to have a sort of authentic and indigenous cast to them. I think that these processes to work, if you're going to be engaging the right people, need to not be seen as some kind of third-party Western value imposition. But again, the US probably needs to play, and other parties, not just the US, a more traditional convening role, a bridging role. But the parties need to be coming to these talks with a view that this is within their own side's interest to do so, and not as players who are being dragged along against their will. I'm conscious of time. I'm going to move over to Dan to give the optimistic wrap-up of this. But suffice it to say, I mean, my colleague, we keep mentioning my former colleague, Scott Lesensky, who is here, who I keep quoting, who told me when I first started at USIP that we're the United States Institute of Peace, we need to be optimistic. And I think that is true, and I think I think there are interesting initiatives afoot. You're seeing USIP has particularly is proud to have been able to support some of these through our grant work and through our programmatic work for time. There are interesting, creative, out-of-the-box initiatives that are being started by people who are looking for ways out of this that don't engage, as I said, the usual suspects only, and that don't only address it in the same direction. But the momentum needs to be capitalized on. Unfortunately, the irony always of track 2 and track 3 engagement is that when you need it most, when official channels have stopped, it's also hard to get the momentum going because people are despairing that there's no movement. So I think at the same time, if the US is going to actively engage, and it is actively going to throw itself behind, and again, as Bill said, because it is in our own self-interest to do so, it needs not only to be addressing the leaders and the policymakers at the top level, but finding a way also to address those below that level who ultimately are going to be the ones that, that give support to the leaders at a time when they really are looking for that public buy-in to move ahead and take bold risks.
So, Dan, it falls to you to tell us how the impossible is possible after all.
All right, so here's the challenge. I'm batting cleanup and I'm not on steroids. So this is going to be really interesting. Let me make 2 preliminary comments. First of all, it's been said before, but I need to say it as well. Thank you to the United States Institute of Peace for the support they gave us for this project 6 years ago, when the 2 books that have emerged from it were just a twinkle in our eyes, and they helped us see this project to fruition. To Jim and to Dick Solomon and to Britt Manzo, who just escaped, was the glue that really kept our group together. And second, I want to be the Mad Magazine commentary on something that Shibley said. You remember Mad Magazine had what he's saying, and then there was the bubble, what he's thinking. But what he's saying was how wonderful it was to work together, and what he's thinking was, my God, it's a miracle we're still talking to each other. But the reality is we are still talking to each other, and I think these 6 years of engagement have been really a lot of fun as well as substantively rewarding. You've heard a lot about the genesis of the book and its intention. We started out with a rather lofty objective, which was described in an initial version of trying to create a story of ground truth, because we were not satisfied with what we were reading about the history of the peace negotiations in the past 20 years, which largely derived from autobiographical first-person accounts. It's not that they were not true, but they were all written through the eyes or through the prism of those who were engaged, and that obviously needs some kind of measure in order to see what happened. I think at best we have at least made a contribution to what's going to be an ongoing study of this set of issues over the past 20 years as more of the archives get open and more of the participants actually produce their autobiographies and memoirs. So hopefully this book will withstand some test of time with some of the more dramatic conclusions that it reached that Bill and Shibley had started to summarize. In that respect, I would kind of divide my remarks into 3 categories and focus on the first 2 of which. The one that I'm not going to focus on is substance, because you've heard from Bill and Shibley that not that substance is easy. The core issues that have eluded agreement among the parties until now are not easy to resolve, both substantively and also politically. You can get a map maker to figure out a squiggly line that divides Arab neighborhoods in Jerusalem from Jewish neighborhoods, and you can pretend that that becomes the automatic answer to the division of the city, but that ignores the fact that both sides have a history and religion and narrative and ideology and emotions that make that squiggly line very difficult to achieve. So when I say I don't want to talk about substance, it's not because it's easy, but because the reality is that the closer or the more recent we have had periods of engagement, the closer the parties have come to substantively bridging their differences. What looked not possible in the early 90s got a little bit more possible by Camp David II, and then became even more possible by the Olmert-Abbas negotiations in September of 2008. Now, it may be that we're talking about the half-life of a tree. The closer you get to the outcome, the further it seems to get away, because you never quite reach that outcome. But the reality is that the 2008 negotiations showed us how close the parties could get essentially on their own. In an administration where, as we indicate in the book, the Secretary of State was surely engaged, but the President wasn't. And as Bill indicated in his remarks, the Middle East parties are wizened enough by this experience that they expect the President to make that last effort. And when President Bush did not make that last effort, and there were a lot of reasons why. It was the end of his administration. It was the end of Olmert's administration. There were back-channel talks going on about what would happen after the Israeli elections. There were a lot of reasons. The fact is that agreement eluded the parties. But what we know about that substance suggests that there is, in fact, the possibility of actually bridging those differences. It leaves us with the two, what I would call major questions, and the ones that are really hardest to be optimistic about. One is the emotions of people themselves. This is a conflict involving people. And the humanitarian distress, which has been described on the Palestinian side, but also needs to be referred to on the Israeli side. Because even if Israelis are occupiers with respect to this 45-year adventure in the West Bank and Gaza and Golan, the fact is that a lot of Israelis have suffered as a result of policies that they may not have wanted their government to pursue, but that happened. So you have a lot of humanitarian distress on both sides, and that has created a really difficult chasm that's going to be hard to overcome with words on paper and formal agreements that get signed. But you also have something that's relatively, I guess you're not supposed to use the word relatively unique. It's either unique or it's not. But allow me, it's relatively unique because I can't think of another conflict where the two contending parties are as close to each other and intertwined with each other and dependent on each other as much as these. I'm fond of the story. In 2000, you may recall, right after the Intifada started, President Clinton at the time asked President Mubarak to convene a summit in Sharm el-Sheikh to try to resolve the issues in the Intifada and end it before it got worse, about 3 weeks into the violence. And there was a really, really nasty meeting among foreign ministers and their aides trying to draft an agreement. Well, at the end of that meeting, we all headed for opposite exit. Nobody wanted to go out the same door as the other parties. Some of us turned around, and there were the Israelis and Palestinians, arm in arm, talking to each other, going to have a cup of coffee. They're the ones who got us into this, and they're killing each other back home, and they were the ones that created the anger and the angst of this meeting, and they were the ones who decided they needed to continue talking, even while the rest of us never wanted to see them again. Now, it doesn't suggest that that emotion, that emotional gulf also is easily bridged. But it does tell you that there is a part of this conflict, and some of it we see in what Lucy was referring to, the non-traditional diplomacy, the people-to-people, track 2, track 1.5 activities, where these people know each other, and they know each other far better than any bunch of diplomats in Washington will ever know them. And in a sense, it's for them that we think about these solutions, and they want it. The polls tell us they want it. Not if you ask them, what about Jerusalem, because then they're far apart. But if you start asking them, what about a complex in which there are trade-offs on Jerusalem and refugees and security and territory, all of a sudden the numbers go up. We've seen it in the Shibley Telhami polls. We've seen it in the Zogby polls. We've seen it in the Khalil Shikaki polls. Every one of these polls over the years tell you that when the two peoples who have this complex relationship actually get to see what it might look like when the trade-offs are put out on the table, the majority numbers are there on both sides. Okay? Doesn't make it easy, but it suggests that there's something to work with. And that then leads to the second of the third issue, of the three issues, and that is the politics. Shibley talked some about the politics, and they're really complex in each of the constituencies. But as complex as they are, this is not rocket science. This is politics under the decision-making of human beings who need to make decisions about whether or not this is an important issue or not an important issue. As Bill told you in his remarks, if an administration is not ready to really give it the effort, but gives lip service to it as a quote-unquote important issue, better to stay home. Because the parties will see through that immediately. In the same way as an envoy who walks in is going to be hampered by the fact that he or she is not the Secretary of State, and even the Secretary of State is going to be hampered by the fact that he or she is not the President. The fact is that the parties have a way of knowing, I don't know how, but they know when America is not serious. But when we are serious, they pay attention. Now, it doesn't mean, and I don't want anything that I say that hopefully will lead you with some sense of optimism, I don't mean anything related to an American plan or an imposed settlement, because that's not going to work. And it's too easy for opponents on any side of this process to argue against the American role by saying, oh, the Americans want to impose a solution. Look, we can't. Jim Baker, back in 1990, 91, made it clear that the 82nd Airborne was not going to land in Atarot Airport in Jerusalem and impose a settlement. It's not going to happen. But the United States has a tremendous amount of diplomatic strength. And if we ask our military to do hard things in the defense of our country, we can ask our diplomats to do hard things in the defense of our country. This is a hard thing. It is not an impossible thing. And it's not impossible because, number one, when administrations, and we indicate this in the book, when administrations seem to know what they're doing, they gain a lot of public support for it. Now, this may sound like a strange argument in a Washington where the weather is a partisan issue, where, you know, what taxi cab you take is a partisan issue. And this is a really bad time to talk about the possibility of building bipartisan support for as emotional an issue as the Middle East peace process. But the reality is that we have seen in the past, true in periods of less partisanship, that when administrations have a keen sense of what they're doing and it's reasonable, they will be given the political space and the time to operate. Not a total freebie, because Congress does have a say, and there will be political opponents for a lot of reasons who may make arguments, and there will be public interest groups and lobbies that will argue whatever their case is, and that's fair. But the reality is that administrations have to know how to navigate that highway. And we have done it in the past, and we can do it in the future, number one. Number two, the argument's going to be made that, okay, let's say the administration does have a strong idea of what it wants to do and is ready to deal with the elbow maneuvering in Washington to create this political space in which to operate. What about the situation in the region? It's really bad out there. Well, the opposite case can be made just as easily. And I like to refer in this context to two leaders who, in their own ways and for their own reasons, understood that the problem in the Middle East is no longer the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's an extra-regional power, Iran, which may affect our entire policy in this region. Yitzhak Rabin in 1992, as we indicate in the book, made clear to then-President George H.W. Bush that he wanted the peace process off the agenda, not by ignoring it, but by resolving it. And his argument in Kennebunkport when he saw the president right after he was elected was, not that I'm a member, as he said to the president, not a member of Peace Now, but we have an emerging issue over the horizon of Iran, and the absence of peace is an inhibitor in my ability as Prime Minister of Israel to deal with that issue. Now, what happened 10 years later? Then Crown Prince, now King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, led the effort to create an Arab peace initiative, not because he's a member of Arab Peace Now, but because for the Saudis, they also understood that regional dynamics and regional politics were changing. And even for the Saudis, who had long been perhaps the most recalcitrant party in the Arab-Israeli conflict, all of a sudden understood that this was not the key to their national security. Get rid of the conflict by resolving it. And you have the Arab Peace Initiative, which is a cosmic change in Arab state policy and Arab state behavior. So you now have a complicated situation in the region, the Arab Spring and the uprisings and all. It's a reason to move faster, not to ignore it. You know what happens when ostriches stick their head in the ground? There are parts of their bodies that are exposed. And that's what's going to happen to all of us if we think that by ignoring this Middle East peace process, because of the Arab Spring, we're going to be safe. We're not going to be safe. And what kind of a Middle East would we see if we gave it the effort that it deserves, with the determination and the urgency and the strength and the resilience and the persistence that the United States can bring to diplomacy, and actually begin to make a change, and what impact that would have on the politics of the region? Countries that don't trust us, as you heard, and they don't trust us in the Middle East. We heard this from various of our military commanders as well as our political leaders, may start to trust us again. And we may get some political capital to start defining for ourselves and to help the region define a situation and a future which is quite different. Finally, one argument that is outside of our purview, because we did talk in the book primarily about American policy, but I think we need at least a word here also about Israel and Israeli policy. And as you heard from David in his introduction, Israelis have a tendency, once they leave office, to get religion. You know, the 6 gatekeepers now understand that it wasn't only about bashing the heads of bad people. It was also creating an environment in which they may have contributed to pushing the idea of peace further away. Last week, Dan Meridor, who is not going to be part of the next government, came out publicly and told us how bad settlements are for the future of the state of Israel. Let's take these people seriously, because what they're understanding is that for Israel, our ally, our friend, and a friend that we should be constant with, so that Israelis can take the tough decisions for peace. For Israelis, this is not a policy or a diplomacy of choice. This is diplomacy of necessity. Democracy, and what Ehud Barak warned against, not I, but Ehud Barak warned against the possibility of apartheid, has to be taken seriously by an Israeli public. So if we're serious about our own policy, and if we're serious about rebuilding the strength of our diplomacy in this region, and if we're serious about being real friends with the state of Israel, it means that we've got to be real serious about trying to make peace. It's not an optimistic idea that I want to leave you with, but a very serious proposition, which is it is time for us to give this our best shot. Not a series of tactics, not a series of one-shot efforts and kind of billiard ball diplomacy. You try something, it doesn't work, and you bounce off to something else, but a sustained policy by the United States that operates on a wide front involving negotiations and confidence-building measures and the Arab Peace Initiative and building the strengths of a Palestinian state and creating the borders and security for the 2 states in the future. We can operate along this multi-dimensional front, and we can make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. I was asked to do 2 things in conclusion, to pose some questions for you and to make some brief summary remarks. And I'm going to leave the questioning to the audience, and I'll turn to you in a couple of minutes. I'm just going to make very brief concluding comments of my own. The first takes off from something that Bill Quandt said, which is that the step-by-step model of diplomacy that we have known, that Henry Kissinger embodied, but he kind of built the model that everybody followed. If I understood Bill, he was saying that just isn't going to work. And so I'm led to think what Bill's boss, a hard-headed observer of the Arab-Israeli problem, if ever there was one, Zbigniew Brzezinski, has been saying consistently since 1974. I had to write an essay about Zbig's views on the Arab-Israeli question, so I've researched this. He's been saying the same thing, which is that the two parties will not achieve, in a step-by-step iterative process, an outcome that we could call a peace agreement. Therefore, the United States, and back at the beginnings, Big used to say the United States and the Soviet Union need to set forth a statement of principles, set forth the basic parameters which will bound a solution. That idea was considered at the beginning of the Obama administration. They rejected it in favor of going the route of an emphatic demand that Israel stop its settlements. And as the book states very clearly, that was a mistake. So if that was a mistake, I am led to think that Zbig's basic point, you need to start with a statement of principles, has a lot of merit to it. The second concluding point I want to make, let's be honest when we look at the history of this conflict. When we have an intractable situation, what changes it? What opens the way for peacemaking? And the answer, unfortunately, is war, or the aftermath of war. Wars in this region seem to reshuffle the deck enough that parties re-examine their options. So you had Kissinger's disengagement diplomacy in '73 that leads in a straight line to Camp David. You had the end of the Cold War and the reshuffling of the deck that embodied, and you had Madrid, and then you had Oslo, and so on. I fear that the pressures for a new intifada are building. As I travel the Arab world, it just seems unlikely to me that the Palestinians will remain permanently immune from this feeling that's sweeping the Arab world. So I think that's my biggest fear, but I would note, if that happens, it's going to reshuffle the deck. Final point. What if the basic pessimism that's underlaying all of these comments, including Dan's, really, what if that's right? What if there isn't any change? What if we don't have a two-state solution? Where are we going to end up? Because I think people do need to think about this with a little more precision. Well, you're going to end up with one state with a very large Palestinian population that wants the rights of equal citizenship, and that's not likely for all kinds of reasons. So you're likely to have one state with two categories of citizenship. I'm not going to use the A word because I do think it's too loaded. It's like analogies to Hitler, just not appropriate. But you are going to have one state with two categories of citizenship, and that's going to be a difficult problem for Israel, for the United States, and especially for the Palestinians. Already, I hear the return of the idea that there is a Palestinian state already. It's called Jordan. And that's been around since the 1980s, since Menachem Begin's prime ministership. And I think that idea is going to come back, as if it's true that there is no solution, there is no Palestinian state that can be created for the reasons that Shibley and others suggest. So my final comment is, it's a truism, I find, in the last few months for people to speak about the Arab Spring, the Arab uprisings, leading to a re-examination of the basic framework of this region, the Sykes-Picot lines, the Jim Marshall mentioned, a peace to end all peace, the world that was created in the Versailles Treaty, the boundaries that were drawn. And I would just note, if that's true, if we're talking about the breakup of a Syrian state into statelets, that I would have the feeling that the boundaries for Israel and Palestine would also be up for grabs. So that's an especially gloomy note on which to close. Fortunately, we have questions coming from the audience and remarks from our panel. And let me turn to Britt Manzo, if Britt is here. And Britt, if you would lead the questioning.
Thank you, Dan. I haven't escaped quite yet. but it's been a pleasure working with all of you, except on the cover. We're going to open up to the audience for questions. There'll be microphones coming down. Our first question does come from Twitter, from Yusuf Munayr of the Palestine Center. Why, if a two-state solution is in Israel's best interest, has Israeli state behavior been to move in the opposite direction? And I suppose any of you can take that one.
Well, look, the reality is that we've been focusing on American policy, and it would be presumptuous to us, of any of us, to comment on the Israeli debate. I think as analysts, we could all offer the argument that Israel has been a society that has been unwilling to make fundamental decisions about what to do with these territories ever since 1967. Policy of settlements has been one of mostly abstraction or not fully thought out in advance. Governments have tended to support what has been done as facts on the ground. And the default position of most coalition governments in Israel has been to not deal with the conflict. In a sense, it relates to one of David's questions, which is the question of is war necessary to make peace? The argument you hear in the Middle East during periods of upheaval is that it's too dangerous to make peace. And the argument you hear when there is no upheaval is that there's no reason to make peace. And that's not just an argument you hear in Israel, but it applies on both sides. So it goes to the issues that we've been talking about, internal politics, lack of decision-making, I think lack of heroic leadership to decide once and for all that the state of Israel would be better off with boundaries that are recognized internationally and security arrangements than it is with an open relationship as it has now with people under occupation.
Well, obviously, it wouldn't be the first nor the last episode of a state not doing what's in its interest. I mean, this is, we know how politics works and coalition politics in Israel work. It obviously is even more the norm than not, even if you observe our foreign policy, some of the decisions that we've made. But I want to say something about the changeability of that, because I know we're all expressing what is translated into pessimism, and it's really about assessment of prospects. But it's not a determinism, and we have to make that clear. Because I think at some level, we have witnessed extraordinary shifts that took place. A lot of it had to do with big events like war that you talked about, where there was paradigmatic shift. Some of it was with leadership. I mean, Sadat, don't underestimate what he did. It wasn't just the 73 war, but the fact that he undertook something really big. And even Oslo, it was really a decisional, you couldn't translate, the end of the Cold War directly into the Oslo Agreement between the PLO and Rabin. So I want to say on American policy particularly, where I think Israeli politics and Palestinian politics are fluid, in large part because they know they're in a bind. They know they don't have a solution on their own. They know there aren't very good options. And they know they're paralyzed in their ability to move. And the biggest barrier of all is this assessment about the possibility. So the question is, can the U.S. provide that in a way that would change the political dynamics both in Israel and the Palestinian areas? If I'm in the president's position, I would not answer no. I would start by answering it's possible. Because if I conclude that this is an important issue to the United States, because it is possible to do. We've seen it happen in the past, but I don't know if I agree fully with my colleague Dan on we shouldn't put our plan. I agree with what you represented at Brzezinski's position, where I think we're at a point where if there's going to be any element from the outside that's going to reshuffle the Israeli public calculations in the political game and the Palestinian public assessment to bet on a solution, it has to be something more than just revival of negotiations. It has to be some clear American ideas on the table that go beyond what's been on the table already. And I think without that, I just don't see a possibility of reviving faith, trust, and hope in the possibility of an outcome.
Dr. Aberdeen.
Thank you for an excellent clinical analysis. I have a question on the role of heroic leadership, because if you look at the region over the last 40 years, when Arab leaders and Israeli leaders and American leaders are engaged seriously in the peace process, the population in Israel and the Arab world and the US will become pro-peace. They want US engagement. And once they stop talking and start fighting, everybody pulls back from peace. Everybody wants to fight. So can you elaborate more on that question of leadership? Because in the end, I think leadership matters, whether it's in politics or business.
Well, I think the easiest thing to say is not the easiest thing to imagine happening, but the easiest thing is if you have strong leaders simultaneously in the United States, Israel, and say Egypt, as we briefly did in 1978, 79, it makes it a lot easier. It doesn't make it inevitable, because strong leaders also know how to say no. But if the stars align and you have strong regional leaders and a strong American leadership role from the president on down, then some very hard decisions become possible. The problem is weak leaders have been the norm in the region, and I think that has been true since at least the late 1990s. There's hardly an Israeli prime minister who's been in power for more than 3 years without having to go back to the electorate and usually doing not very well in the re-election. So, and Palestinian divisions have made it hard. The Americans are the ones who have least excuse. We, after all, don't have to worry about the legitimacy of our governments. We elect them, or usually elect them with, the Electoral College and the popular vote on their side. But even when we don't, we accept that they have the legitimacy to act in the name of the country, especially on foreign affairs. It's a lot easier on foreign affairs than on domestic affairs. So we don't have as much of an excuse. We have a choice to make. And some presidents have chosen. I think the first Bush presidency did. I think Clinton off and on did. And I think Obama began to, but then realized he had other things to do and it was costly. The one who clearly chose not to was the second Bush. So we also have choices to make. But it's not just about what we want. It's also how do you strengthen leaders who may want to take some risks, but are under pressure domestically to hold back. These are hard decisions for them. So part of what a strong American leader does is try to bolster those in the region who want to cooperate on this project. But you're right, leadership does matter. I strongly believe that. This is not going to ever get solved unless you have some fairly visionary leaders who help to make it happen.
Thank you. For those of you watching online, we are also taking questions via Twitter. Just tweet with the hashtag #PeacePuzzle. David?
Hi, Dr. David Weinberg with the UCLA Center for Middle East Development. You provided some general commandments in the book and in your talk about successful Arab-Israeli peacemaking. And I'd like to urge you to talk a little bit also about the specific religious commentary that follows on it in this particular situation. So, Shibley, you did this a little bit in your last comments, but given that the President of the United States is going to the region soon, given that the Secretary of State is going to be engaging in this issue to some extent pretty soon as well, what specific concrete measures would you recommend to these parties to pursue in the region?
If I may, on this one, the first thing is the administration is obviously trying hard not to raise expectations. They know that part of the problem in the first administration was they raised expectations so high and then crashed. And they're trying to do that. But I don't think that works as a strategy, because when you're sending the Secretary of State, you're sending the President of the United States very early in an administration to a region that you know is looking for something, expectations inevitably high. So people are going to want something. And I'm not sure, and I hope there was a lot of, we talked about preparation, I hope there was a lot of preparation thinking about it ahead, because this is not just a political decision. I think what I fear is there's this instinct on the Obama administration As you know, there was a lot of pressure on the president to go to Israel in the first term. They didn't want to look like they're buckling under pressure to go. They were looking to create their own opportunity to go. It never came in the first administration. They weren't going to wait for the pressure to come and buckle under it to go, so they announced it quickly before maybe they have cooked a real strategy about what the president intends to get out of it and the expectation game. So I'm a little fearful that there isn't all that much space now to do it. But I would say one thing, which is I can understand a president can say what we just were talking about. I'm going to make an assessment. The assessment is, look at the expert. They're saying, well, the likelihood is not much is going to happen, so I'm just going to try to do conflict management. I'm going to pull back. And a president, when they are going to put a plan or do any kind of initiative on which they're going to be judged, they're obviously going to first ask, is there a chance for success or failure? And part of the problem for failure historically has been, and that was true in every administration, is that you ask, A, your credibility is going to be undermined, but even more importantly, that leaves Israelis and Palestinians no place to go. So they go into more conflict. When they've tried, expectations are high and they're gone. The problem right now is we're beyond that, because there is no chance they're going to get anywhere. And it's going to, whether it's what David said, there'll be another intifada, or there's going to be conflict between Israel and Hamas, or something is going to give, because it's, we're toward the end of the road, and the number of people who don't believe two-state solution is going to happen anyway is increasing. So you're at a point where when you're taking a risk, you're not taking as much of a risk as you think. And I think the reality of it is, it is always possible. You can't do diplomacy thinking everything is determined. Even if the risk is relatively high and the prospects are even less than 50-50, is still worth doing it. And that would be the advice that I would give.
I would want to add, but also maybe approach this issue from a slightly different perspective. First of all, thank you to David for helping us with the book. He got a footnote. This is a shout out for your help. One of the issues that we identify in this book is the lack of distinction often made in American policymaking between tactics and strategy, or tactics and policy. And very often you will find the knee-jerk response to what is your policy to be, well, let's get to negotiations, as though that's the policy. That's the tactical approach to achieve an outcome. So the argument, I think, that was implicit or even explicit in your question is, should we approach the period ahead, presidential visit, Secretary of State visit, as an extension of our previous efforts simply to get the parties back to the table, or should we try something different? And this goes to David's opening question. In a different book that Bill and I collaborated on called Pathways to Peace, there's an appendix that has a full-blown model of parameters. But the parameters suggested not necessarily to put on the table, but for the United States to think about its own policy and then to decide what it wants to do with it. Do you use them as terms of reference? Do you use it as an American plan? Do you use it as principles? Do you use it as a Security Council resolution? You have a lot of tactical options that you can choose from once you've decided what your policy is. And right now, we don't have a very clear idea of our policy with respect to Jerusalem, territory, refugees, settlements. You go down the list. So I would make the argument, and this does correspond to what Shibley just said, before running out to the region, I think the President and the Secretary ought to sit back for a while and figure it out what it is that we want to accomplish. Now, if it's only to get to negotiations, I would save the mileage, because it's not going to work in a context where the politics there and here are so challenging. If we want to be serious and we know where we want to get to and what constitutes a serious policy and strategy, then you can decide on what your tactics are going to be to achieve that.
Unfortunately, Mr. Ignatius is being pulled away from us, but we will continue with questions.
Let me just, one of the drawbacks of being a columnist is that you actually have to write columns occasionally, and I have one that's due this afternoon and not finished. So I do want to, there's so many questions, I don't want to interfere with that, so I'm just going to scoot. But Thanks to the panel and to the USIP.
Thank you. Ambassador Lewis, did you have a question?
Ode sort of preempted my question about leadership, because leadership wasn't discussed by any of you in your introductory comments. And by the way, the book is terrific. I'm really proud of what you've achieved. And I remember the beginning looked rather complicated. You made it look great. But the question on leadership, it seems to me, gets back to the issue that David raised. One way, when you confront an unpromising array of leaders that you can't re-elect or change, is to stir things up, but not with a war, but with something else that prompts them or forces them to do something different. And it seems to me that the example that occurred in the Carter administration is worth thinking about. Carter came in with Spig's plan, a comprehensive approach to the Middle East devised in the Brookings Report, leading to a Geneva conference, sent out the Secretary of State to get everybody on board for that plan, laid out the plan, several months of travel, it wasn't working. But what it did do was to force an initiative by Sadat to go to Jerusalem. He was afraid to lose the chance of peace, and there had been some second-track diplomacy, which had assured both parties that there might be a peace there to get. And this comes back to Lucy's point. You need second-track diplomacy between officials, secret contacts between officials or authorized representatives, to convince the two parties that there may be a deal we can live with before we go public about it. That does need to be going on, but it's not enough. The leaders have got to take risks. Now, they don't want to take risks right now for a variety of reasons, political on both sides. But if you've now followed the Brzezinski formula and you laid out either in any one of those possible tactical possibilities that Dan was just suggesting, in a Security Council resolution would be my preferred route. But a big speech by the president after he and Kerry had both surveyed the possible. A proposal, a rounded proposal of principles that may be the ones right in your book. As the U.S. position, and neither leaders are strong enough to react positively and try all sorts of ways to counteract it. But if you leave it out there, you don't back away from it, then they will begin doing things bilaterally with each other. That's your hope, but secretly. And that's how you get back, them to get back to negotiations about things which you may or may not be in a position to propose yourself. I've never been a great fan of the Brzezinski model, but I think if it ever would be useful, it might be in the next 3 or 4 months.
Thank you. We have 2 questions from Twitter, 2 separate questions. One is, now that Egypt is reinvested, where does this leave the peace process? The second is, what role can the EU and the rest of the international community play?
What was the first one again? The first one?
The first one was, now that Egypt is reinvested in the region, where does this leave the peace process? So, the change of power in Egypt, where do you see?
If you don't mind, I'll address the Egypt one, because I think it's a really critical piece. I mean, we have a lot to say on it, but I think there is no question that the revolution in Egypt has consequences for the prospects of peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And I know a lot of people look at it more from the negative, which is that the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty had been an anchor of the regional stability. Looking at it in terms of the Israeli assessment of the prospects of war and fears, that if this is essentially coming into question or shaken, Israel's fear more insecure to move forward. But there is another side to it. I think that is in part true, no question about that. Although every evidence is that Egypt and even the Muslim Brotherhood sees value in maintaining the peace treaty, the psychology of it is still a bit shaky. But there is an opportunity, I think, that we're, if in fact, in the context, if we build it into a peace process. I think one of the incentives for the Israelis has always been not only resolving their conflict with the Palestinians. That's always been an issue. That is why there was the Arab peace plan with the idea that the advantages and the assets for Egypt are much greater if it makes peace with Palestinians. It's going to make peace with the rest of the Arab world. The Israelis, in a way, for really since the 1980s, have taken for granted the Egyptian-Israeli treaty, even though it was a huge, very important part of their notion of regional stability. Right now, they can't take it for granted. In the context of a revived peace process and a revived Arab peace plan, if Egypt is part of a renewed effort to reconsolidate relations, it's a much greater incentive. And so in the context of a possibility of a comprehensive peace, actually Egypt could weigh in positively on Israeli discourse and Israeli assessments of what might come. In the short term, there is no question that Egypt's role has helped Hamas. The Muslim Brotherhood has been close to Hamas. Morsi has been supportive of Hamas. We saw that very much in the negotiation between Israel and Hamas over the recent Gaza war, where very different kind of role for Egypt than under Mubarak. And in fact, the terms of the agreement between Hamas and Israel were much more favorable to Hamas than they would have been without Morsi. No question about that. So Egypt has weighed in part, in favor of the Palestinians. I think is likely to be more of an asset on the long term if we build it into a peace process. If we don't, then they're going to be on the other side of the equation.
And the other question was, what role can the EU and the rest of the international community play? Now, you can take that as if the Obama administration doesn't do anything, move forward, or if they do, you could take that either way. Anyone?
Look, the United States has worked for years with the so-called quartet, the European Union, the United Nations, and Russia, but not very productively because there hasn't been a serious strategy for advancing the peace process, and therefore this is a mechanism that I don't think has reached its potential. The last time I looked, the United States and Europe were essentially of one mind with respect to the need for a two-state solution. And therefore, if Washington gets serious, I think Washington could not only count on European support, but I think Europe would look to the United States for the kind of leadership that we're able to show. And in that respect, the Europeans bring tremendous political weight. The trade relations with the region and the prospect of enhanced economic and other relations in the future would add a tremendous adjunct to the political issues that are going to be very difficult to achieve. Europeans for some time have been unwilling to accept only a financial role, and therefore it's going to be, I think, necessary to see to what extent its political and security interests can also be accommodated. But you have examples, for example, in Hebron with the temporary international presence, EU COPS along the Gaza-Egypt border, efforts by the Europeans to establish the credibility of a security role that is going to be very important in a future settlement. Not 100% sure that it's going to be accepted by both sides easily, but at least we can go into this process assuming that we can play with this and see how we shape how it affects the outcome.
Questions from the audience? Right here.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for appearing for this excellent presentation. I'm Monica Coleman with Inside Capitol Hill PWR Talk Network. And my question is that the nominated Secretary of Defense, Chuck Hagel, has supported negotiations, direct negotiations between the U.S. and Hamas and Hezbollah, which of course are considered terrorist groups by the US and some of our Western allies. My question is, do you support such a policy? Do you think it would be advantageous, and what would be the advantages, the disadvantages between US-Israeli relationships and the peace process?
Look, I don't think there's any, I'm not going to comment on Senator Hagel's comments or positions. With respect to my own views, and I don't know if my colleagues share them, I don't see any particular value for the United States to open up a particularly separate channel with Hamas, but I also don't see any particular value in the United States standing in the way of a Palestinian reconciliation process in which the outcome assures that the PLO, which is the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, remains committed to its recognition of Israel and its renunciation of terrorism and its participation in negotiations. So on the one hand, I don't know what value we would add right now to enhancing Hamas's status, but I would also like to see us defer a certain amount to the Palestinian Authority, PLO's judgment with respect to how to frame reconciliation, again, provided that the outcome adheres to the conditions under which the PLO participates in this peace process.
If I may, on the Hamas issue, I mean, 4 years ago, in the context of the Council on Foreign Relations and Brookings proposals for the new administration, my colleague Steve Cook and I wrote a set of recommendations that included supporting the idea of Hamas-Fatah reconciliation in preparation for a major peace initiative. I believe actually that in the first term, the Obama administration never really excluded that. The idea, obviously with some conditions, the question is whether you maintain the strict conditions or you have a different set of conditions for coalition than you would have in a bilateral negotiation with Hamas. But I could tell you that the assumption of the administration was that a negotiation may be possible with the Palestinian Authority alone directly, but ultimately that no agreement could be sold to the Palestinians, be accepted without some acceptance from Hamas. And so the question was, at what point do you bring them into the process and under what circumstances? And there was a sense that that essentially you wanted to wait for the Palestinian Authority to have more of an upper hand and therefore be in a position to strengthen the come together. It worked the other way around. Obviously, it never got there. And so the administration in the first term wasn't entirely close to this idea, may have had differences on what conditions and the timing, but there was a sense that at the early stage of negotiations to make any breakthrough, it was better to keep them out. I don't know if this has changed, but certainly in terms of the stated policy of the U.S. now, it is clear that the U.S. still is not supportive of bringing the two together. It's been a bit of a sore point between the United States and the Egyptian government, because there's no question that Morsi thinks this is a priority issue for him for a variety of reasons, that he wants to try to bring Hamas and Fatah together. And it is one of the talking points in the relationship between the United States and Egypt now.
If I may, though, on there, that one of the values just relates to the previous question about what role the Europeans could play. If you look at the value of, if there's some necessity to hear the voices and get a sense, and that value comes at the track 2 level, one way in which the Europeans have more flexibility than the US is to engage in some of those non-official conversations in a way that the US can't.
Yoram Perry.
I'm Yoram Perry, the director of the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies at the University of Maryland. Dan, you mentioned the decision that, that brought a rabbin to start the negotiations with the Palestinians, and that is the 10 years of window of opportunity, that was his term, before there's a threat from Iraq, and he was thinking of Libya as well. Don't you think that you can use, you were talking about almost 2 hours about the problem without mentioning Iran? don't you think the nuclear threat from Iran can be used by the United States for restarting the negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinians?
I think I mentioned that Rabin's thinking in 1992, and he had made a speech in 1991 actually focused on Iran. It wasn't Iraq. He saw the over-the-horizon threat to Israel in the course of the coming 10 years as coming from Iran, and therefore he wanted to resolve not just the Palestinian issue. He told George H.W. Bush he wanted to resolve the peace process. And that's why you saw Rabin's initiatives on both tracks, Oslo being an initiative that he supported, may not have initiated, but supported on the Palestinian track, and the so-called deposit or pocket that he proposed on the Syrian track. So it was an Iran-focused strategic objective on the part of Rabin, and in a sense, we missed that window. 10 years later, it was the Saudis who revived that idea, because by then they understood that the now not over the horizon but immediate threat was coming from an Iran which was clear even in the early part of this century, was seeking some kind of regional prominence as well as a possibility of nuclear weapons at that point. So both Israel and Saudi Arabia understood the threat from Iran as connected to the resolution of this conflict.
Military intelligence spoke about Iraq as well, but that's not the point. What is the future? Can't the Iranian threat today can be used to enhance negotiations between Israel and Palestine?
Yes.
So how?
Well, it feeds into what we've been talking about, which is the calculations of political leaders. Do political leaders say, because there's an Iranian threat, we're now going to see if we can just put this Palestinian conflict on the shelf and deal with it later? Or do they say, to the extent that we can actually make progress in resolving it, we may actually be able to build coalitions of support and encouragement in the region? The kind of coalitions that we saw emerging in the 1990s in the multilateral aspect of the Madrid process that could be helpful in strategic terms in dealing with the Iranian threat. So sure, the answer is, not just that the Arab Spring should be, or the Arab upheaval should be a strategic reason for Israel and Palestinians to make progress, but also the Iranian threat.
I think we have time for 2 more questions here.
Hi, I'm Steve Kolecki. I'm the director of the Office of International Justice and Peace at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. I was very struck with Shibley's remark about the collapse of trust. And I would argue, although you hear comments about hope, there's a real collapse of hope. There's a hopelessness, a resignation in the region. And I'm wondering, working for a group of religious leaders, how I know Jewish, Christian, and Muslim religious leaders here in the United States have really come together to speak with one voice on these questions, and they have counterparts in the region who have attempted to do similar things. And I'm wondering, to what extent can religious leaders and the wider religious community contribute to a climate in which bold U.S. leadership might have a chance of success?
I'm, of course, a big advocate of outreach and Track 2 and NGO role and people-to-people. I've been involved in many of them, find great utility on them. It's always helpful, even if you win one or build a coalition or lay down the groundwork for a time when you're going to be able to use that network that you build for real opportunities. Always useful. But it isn't going to transform the trust gap. Because it is too profound, it's too important, it's too built into a history that is particularly painful. And if nothing sort of a major event that create a paradigmatic shift can do it. I hope it's not going to be war. We know, as David said, I think historically that happens. But you need something much bigger than that at a level that captures the imagination and changes the betting. But for now, the betting is clearly in the opposite direction.
I'd like to give you a somewhat more practical response. There are some activities already underway on the ground. Lucy would characterize them as Track 2 or Track 3 or people-to-people, whatever they're called. some of them need money. Some of them need resources in order to proceed. And it's hard to get resources out of the United States or European governments now because everybody's still in the aftershock of financial crises. Now, I don't want to suggest that money solves all problems, but if we know that these little roots are budding, the question is, can we find ways to encourage that through the resources needed to persist, whether it's Jewish, Muslim, Christian, or in some cases it's even Jewish-Jewish or Muslim-Muslim, which a variety of these dialogues are already underway and they cost. So if there's an interest on the part of our non-official community to be supportive, that's one way to do it.
Lucy, did you have?
No, I would just add that some of these initiatives that Dan mentions, I think the power of some of these that are underfunded is that in a lot of ways, some of these new and smaller initiatives are really tapping into religious leaders that have the true legitimacy and reach within their communities in the way that some of these previous efforts, there's maybe a lot of symbolic legitimacy to the leadership, but there's not always been the ability for that to translate into more than making statements, on behalf of the church, on behalf of the chief rabbinate, on behalf of, the Waqf, but that doesn't really carry weight with a clear constituency.
You need one thing that we're very aware of is that you need a network of relationships on the ground, and all of our religious institutions, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim, do have those relationships on the ground and are fostering those contexts and are helping to fund some of them and so forth. So that's an affirmation of that effort, and I take it as such. But I think Shibley's point is well taken, that we need something bigger that then people can rally around in order to really shift things. And
yeah, but I don't leave us depressed on this issue. There's too much religious support in this country for bad things, for settlements, for example. Money collected that's going right into the settlements, and why not try to collect some money that goes into these nascent dialogues and see what they do. Are they going to transform a calculation by Abbas or Netanyahu to make peace? No. But are they going to begin a process of finding common language and common ground? Yeah, maybe. And why not at least parallel some of the bad efforts that are being funded by religious communities in our country with positive efforts?
Our last question.
My name is Jeremy Borgia. I'm an intern from Brigham Young University. Many of the comments, especially at the beginning, were pessimistic in expressing that perhaps the two-state solution is dead or not realistic at this time. If that indeed is true and the current situation gets kind of kicked down the field where, like the comment earlier, a one-state solution with a two-tiered citizenry, do you see the United States shifting its policy towards Israel and perhaps applying some pressure to try to provide equal rights or equal protection for all the citizens of that one state?
Well, frankly, I don't see it happening. So, we could make projections about hypothetical cases. In about 2 weeks' time, my graduate students at Princeton are going to put online a study they undertook of whether there really are alternatives to a two-state solution. And they approached it very seriously. They said, we're not going to be biased in advance that we must conclude that there's a two-state solution. Everything else fails the test of seriousness with respect to the interests of the major parties. So, hypothetically, you can make all kinds of speculations. The reality is that the closer we get to whatever you want to call it, the political cliff of when people decide that maybe the two-state solution is really starting to fall off the edge, we're going to have to come back to it. And we're going to have to find parachutes or safety nets or whatever you want to call it, because there is not an alternative to partition of this land into two states for the two people who claim it as their respective homelands.
Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you for our speakers for your insights.